What happens when a musician takes the stage and interprets a piece of music written several centuries ago? We're going to explore that via a look at the career of the great pianist Alfred Brendel, recorded in connection with Brendel's 91st birthday. There was something remarkable, I think, but also a little tragic about when Alfred Brendel finally retired. His last couple of concerts were in Vienna in 2008 at the Musikverein, and he was playing Mozart's great Ninth Piano Concerto with Charles Mackerras. I was there. When I walked out, I felt how important it was for Alfred that he didn't retire 5 years before that point, because he improved so much just in the last few years of his career on the stage. He was a few weeks short of 78. He planned to retire in his mid-70s, but friends persuaded him to go on for 2 or 3 more years. And that was clearly the right decision, because out of that we got particular recordings that are remarkable. He played, and at the end allowed to be recorded playing some pieces better than he had ever played them, and perhaps better than anybody had ever played them. And that's the positive bit. The tragic bit is that if human beings had the capacity to be at physical peak longer than 80 years, if lucky, then Alfred Brendel would have carried on developing as a musician and carried on playing even better. And I don't think this necessarily goes on indefinitely. I think there is a certain period of development that makes sense. And if I were to make a guess, and I think Alfred privately thinks the same too, I'd say that's about 110 years. And so what's been striking since Alfred retired is that he has evolved as a pianist and improved, even though several things, of course, got worse in terms of the digital output and in terms of a terrible hearing challenge that he developed. And so this is absolutely fascinating. And when we've got a retired artist getting better, but no longer having the physical capacity to facilitate this improvement, that feels almost like a message from another world. A message from another world in which, you are not living for 80 or 90 years, but for 110 or 120. And so I think that if I had to say one thing about Brendel across his life, I'd say that he was amazing at evolving and amazing at understanding how to integrate his talent into the reality of a world in which you've got to develop your talent in time. He measured it perfectly. In other words, I think if he had gone on a few more years, the decline in motoric output, Brendel has this wonderful expression, artists shouldn't become glorifications of arthritis on the stage, would have outweighed the benefit of the remarkable interpretive improvements he was still continuing to move forward with. Now, somebody might say, well, what about then us just receiving imperfect performances, less physically stable performances? Isn't that marvelous? After all, look at so many performances by Alfred Cortot or Edwin Fischer, which are full of instability and full of mistakes, but also full of magical moments. When a player makes this kind of decision, very often on top of the physical considerations, they're coming at it from the point of view of whether they are inherently in love with musical process, whether they are inherently in love with being just connected to music, and indeed even connected to music in public. And if you're not, and Brendel is certainly not, he doesn't love musical process as such, he is interested in musical results. If you're not, and you're seeing that the physical decline will outweigh the artistic development, then it could be reasonable to hang up your boots. And when he did, he joked that other people were crying, but he didn't shed a tear himself. Let's take an example from Alfred Brendel's last year on the platform. He brought back several pieces to play them again because he felt he didn't do them justice before. The clearest example of this is Mozart's F major piano sonata, Köchel 533. And here I'm just parroting Alfred Brendel's view. I do think that the best recording up until Alfred Brendel's last year on the platform of that sonata was Alfred Brendel's own recording from about a decade before then. But it was a failure in my view. It was the best recording of that piece in history, but it was a failure, which means that that piece had never been played well. And it's a very difficult piece to play well. And Brendel brought it back and played it in a satisfactory way. And he knew he had to do that because it's only then that he reached an adequate understanding of what Mozart was requiring in that score. And now, Alfred's November 2008 recording, we have a successful reading of that really great piano sonata. But you've got to be honest about that. And it's true that if Kit Armstrong played Köchel 533, what would happen is nothing. It would sound like empty space. That's a particularly extreme example of a very difficult piece that the most talented young musicians in the world are still not ready for. Hopefully one or two of them will be ready in time. And that sounds so bizarre, I think, to most people, because we're used to thinking that when something is done better than anybody has ever done it, that must be an extraordinary achievement. But of course, one of the funny things about the interpretive arts is that things are not done well enough by the people who do them better than anybody else in the world. I mean, there are still piano pieces that have never been recorded well, for example. That might change in this century. So this is the reality we're looking at, and I think that you've got to be very, very humble about how far you still don't understand things. And it might be that with certain pieces, even if you're an experienced and brilliant musician, you still haven't crossed that threshold of basically saying, okay, now I get it. Now I get it, whereas before I was just short of that bar. When Chopin produces a piece, or Beethoven or Schubert produce a piece, they often bring it into the world in a matter of weeks, sometimes days, and then they largely move forward from it. At the same time, Alfred Brendel was performing as a professional pianist from the late 40s. That is 60 years of thinking about a Schubert piece that Schubert would have thought about for 2 weeks. So the extent of contact that a player has with a composer's piece is 100x that of the composer's. Now there is a second difference here that's a neighboring one that's really important, and that's that the composer has typically a deeper unconscious understanding of the piece than the performer, but the performer has a more elaborate and constructed conscious understanding of the piece. Many of the questions that Brendel would raise about what's going on in a particular score over decades and decades and decades are things that the composer would be barely conscious of at all. So we've got to realize that there is this product coming out of the unconscious mind of an artistic genius being released into the world via the medium of a certain art form. And then come interpreters who play the piece, and they ask and re-ask thousands of conscious questions about what is going on in the score. And I think that is a very, very vast asymmetry. And that is why even I am comfortable to say that there are certain compositions with which I am more familiar than the composer was, just because I have put in 20 or 30x the number of hours into looking at them than the composer has. The other thing that's really important to mention is that if we are saying that what Alfred Brendel is doing is possible at all, then we have to believe in some very universal features of human nature. Because if there aren't these universal features to human nature, then there is no way that we can stably and objectively interpret what is going on inside a particular score. Even with a great musician like Alfred Brendel, it may sound like what he's doing is the only way to do it. That's not true. There are other ways to do it. But what we do have to accept is that there are certain boundaries. And when you get out of these boundaries, you as Edwin Fischer used to say, and Brendel loves quoting this, do violence to the piece. It's completely possible to both say that there's a very definite meaning that a piece has and every note in the piece has. At the same time, that doesn't mean that there is a single way to play it. And this is what Artur Schnabel was talking about when he said that the great Central European masterpieces are greater compositions than they can actually be played. He meant that there was a multiplicity of allowable interpretations. And I have a particular personal view here about this question, because most colleagues tend to say that the piece underdetermines performance. I tend to say that the piece overdetermines performance. In other words, when we look at the score, my personal experience isn't, oh goody, these are the musts and these are all the optional things that I can choose according to my own preference. No, I feel that the piece pushes me in several incompatible directions and I have to choose what to lose. And therefore, my preference when we talk about the multiple realizability of a score in sound is to say that very often a great masterpiece will overdetermine performance rather than underdetermining it. But the conclusion is the same. There is more than one right way to do it, but of course there are also many wrong ways to do it too.
Wie die omkomt, kan jullie die lorre mee, ja.